So now to give a brief overview of how surrogacy has evolved over time. Traditional surrogacy has been around forever, for as long as we can ever remember. And like many other things in our history, traditional surrogacy has many instances where we find there's an exploitation of the surrogate mother. So, for example, the first mention of traditional surrogacy is seen in the book of Genesis and the story of Sarah and Abraham. Sarah was not able to conceive her own children, so they essentially forced Sarah's servant Hagar to carry a baby for them. Therefore, Hagar was the biological mother of Abraham and Sarah's son. Now we fast forward to 1884, and here is where we have our first successful artificial insemination event in Philadelphia. So basically what happened in 1884 was that in front of 6 medical patients, a doctor put a woman to sleep using chloroform and essentially inseminated her with a rubber syringe using the semen of the most attractive medical student in the room. The woman was actually under the impression that it was going to be her husband's semen that was going to be injected in her, but it actually turned out that her husband's semen was not working properly, and that was the reason why they couldn't have kids. And the doctor and the woman's husband agreed to never let her know who the real biological father was of the child. And then in 1975 is where we have our first successful IVF embryo transfer. Unfortunately, the embryo transfer was not successful. It was an ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic, in case you don't know, it just means when the embryo implantation takes place outside of the uterus and not in the uterus. And then just 1 year later is where we have the birth of the surrogacy industry in the United States. So Noel King was known as the father of surrogate parenting. He was a lawyer, and he brokered the first legal uncompensated traditional surrogacy agreement. So this doesn't mean that traditional surrogacy was not taking place in the United States before 1976. It's just that there was no legal contract associated with the journey. Keene used his experience in 1976 to essentially establish the first surrogacy agency, the Infertility Center. And this agency would go on to arrange hundreds of pregnancies a year. So in 1978 is where we see the birth of the first baby conceived through IVF, Miss Louise Brown. And just 2 years later, we have our first compensated traditional surrogacy arrangement. So the surrogacy agreement that was arranged 4 years earlier in 1976 was actually not compensated, and we didn't start seeing compensated journeys until 1980. And then in 1985, 5 years later, is where we have our first gestational surrogacy journey. So this is where gestational surrogacy slowly is replacing traditional surrogacy in the United States. And from 1999 until 2013, there have been more than 18,400 babies born to gestational carriers. And in 2018, according to the CDC, 4.7% of all embryo transfers involved a gestational carrier in that year alone. So that's approximately 6,162 embryo transfers. Now, not all embryo transfers are fortunate and result in a baby, but as we'll talk about later on in this course, about 50% are successful. So that's a lot of babies.